Welcome everyone again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that focuses on the innovators and inspiring people that are working to move the human story forward. I'm Amanda Christensen, an ideaXme guest contributor, and I'm here today with Nitendra Rajput, VP and head of Mastercard's AI Garage in India. Nitendra, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, and I look forward to discussing stuff with you.
So to get started, it would be great if you could give me a little bit of your background and really kind of how you became interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Sure. I mean, it's a long journey though, but interestingly, when I finished my master's from IIT Bombay and then went on to my first job at IBM Research, I started to get into this space of being able to understand human voice, which is now called as speech recognition, which you would know through the Alexas and the Siris of the world. But I'm talking like 20 years or more back. Right. So it was a very fascinating thing to actually see that can a human, the way a human actually understands voice and speech, can it be understood by a machine? And that too, when IBM Research was starting in India, it was looking at problems that are centric to India. And the Indian geography is generally more vocal in nature as opposed to written from a cultural perspective. And therefore, doing speech recognition systems for Indian languages was in some sense important and also exciting because I've been born and brought up in that culture. And no such systems existed that could understand the Indian language. One of the languages that I worked on was Hindi. And that's what got me excited. And then I still remember it was like 2 years down the journey of working on this product. And eventually once I spoke a sentence and I could see the text written on the screen, it was a very humbling experience to see what you're speaking is actually now being written on the screen. There were times when this was magic in some sense.
Right.
When we started to work on this space, then we realized that it is just not just a technology, but it can actually enable many solutions, and that too solutions that can empower people. So people who did not have access to internet or who were in some sense did not have the right device literacy to be able to operate menus and so on, they could then speak to the system and the system could give them information about weather, about their crops, about what they're producing in the farms. Can it be sold at a higher price at a nearby market, and so on and so forth. And suddenly we could actually see the societal impact of this simple technology. And that actually made me even more fascinated to work in this space. And back then, I don't think this area was called as machine learning or AI, but we use similar techniques that we use now and we call them machine learning and AI. But what interested me is the closeness with which machine learning and AI works with human beings. The example that I gave is a solution which people can directly use and benefit from it because it is a much more natural interaction and so on. Similarly, today when we see things as humans, and similarly if a camera can capture stuff and it can understand and tell me that this is X plant or this particular plant seems to have this particular disease and so on. So those things become very helpful and easy and operative. That's what started to fascinate me. But what intrigued me even more was that this whole area of machine learning and AI was getting developed because of the strength of compute and algorithms and so on. But at the same time, it was dependent on the ability of human beings to be able to understand human brain. So if you look at ML and AI now, and if we look back, then actually these algorithms have been developed in some sense starting from neuroscientists. So they actually map our brain and then they identify what parts of our brain are responsible when we see things versus what parts of our brain are responsible when we listen to stuff and understand language versus what part of our brain is responsible when we have to do logical calculations, 7 multiplied by 12 and so on. And then they provide hints, and then machine learning engineers and computer scientists actually come and build an approximation of that into what is now called as a deep neural network. and the different forms of deep neural networks and so on. The more we understand the algorithms, then we go back to the brain and understand our brain, how we think and operate. The more we do that, then it comes back to algorithms. So this whole area of evolving a human being along with evolving a machine is something that is even more fascinating. I didn't know this when I started this journey, but looking back, it now excites me, and I feel thankful that I've been on this journey. But yeah, in some sense, that's my roadmap towards moving into artificial intelligence and machine learning.
That's fascinating, being able to kind of see the first-hand societal impacts alongside it, and then be able to kind of review it looking back and see those connections in between, like the neural networks and how the brains operate and how they're operating in symbiosis with one another. It would be great if you could talk about some of the current work that you're doing with Mastercard's AI Garage as well.
Sure, absolutely. So Mastercard set up this unit called AI Garage with a very fascinating vision that anything that we do in the company should be powered by AI. And it is actually pretty natural because human beings are making decisions at every point in time, not just at Mastercard, but any big organization. And if machines can aid those decision making, then those decisions can become much more powerful, they can become much more faster, and they can perhaps become even more accurate. Let me take a few examples. So one example is trying to forecast the revenue of the company Mastercard for the next quarter, for the next year, and so on. Now, this is important because the company would want to tell the Wall Street as to what its expectation is going forward, and the investors, based on that, make their decisions on whether to invest in the company or not. Now, how do we identify what my revenue is going to be in the next quarter? This is a prediction type of a problem. There are people, there are analysts who look at large amounts of data, not just within MasterCard, in some sense that how is the MasterCard product moving, how are the number of cards moving, how is the sales, and so on and so forth, but also externally. How is the external market doing? How is the competition doing? And so on. They put all of these things in their head, and experienced people can then make a decision, or at least come to some kind of an inference that going forward, things look rosy versus not, and so on. Now, the ability of machines to be able to churn out large amount of data is all very evident. And therefore, machines can actually take significantly large amount of data, process it, and then predict the revenue for the next quarter, identify dependencies, and MasterCard being a company that is operating in more than 200 countries, things become even more complex for some single person to put all of that in their head. And therefore, the nuances of the fact that if some company is doing well in one country, how is the effect of it in the other, and so on, all of that can actually be identified. And therefore, this is one example where AI is being used within MasterCard. Another one being a simple example of when you swipe your card, the card eventually hits one of the payment gateway servers. And if a server is down, then the transaction will not go through. So it's really important for us to figure out or predict ahead of time if a server is going to fail so that you can apply redundancies. Now, how do we identify whether a server is going to fail or not? A server, in some sense, is also like a human being. A human being also gives some signals that maybe I'm feeling weak or I am having these symptoms and so on. And later on, a doctor can diagnose that, oh, yes, this thing looks serious and therefore things don't look good and so on. Similarly, servers emit logs every second or millisecond and so on. AI algorithms can actually look at those sequence of logs and see in the past if this sequence of logs was generated, did the server survive or fail? And therefore, when the sequence starts generating, ahead of time, I can say that, oh, this server seems to be failing. It may fail in the next 6 hours. I get that huge opportunity of 6 hours to be able to fix things before it actually fails, which means the transactions can actually go through, which means the customer experience is better and so on. So these are just a couple of examples, but we are actually going much ahead in terms of looking at AI try to impact sales, looking at trying to figure out what are the best products that should be recommended to which banks and issuers and so on, looking at trying to identify things like for a particular transaction, is it fraudulent or not? Is it leading to something which is called as anti-money laundering, a sequence of transactions which can lead to illegal activities and so on. Now, all of these things are in some sense dependent on significantly large amount of data, which is the strength of machine learning, and also being able to predict the future, which is again where machine learning is used. So these are some examples where there are many, more than 200 or so, but some good examples that you can get a sense of where Mastercard is taking AI into.
Fantastic. And this is incredibly pertinent, especially as, particularly with the current climate that's going on, companies are looking to rapidly digitize and increase efficiencies across all spectrums. And forgive me if I'm wrong here, but the more that these systems learn and operate with these data points, the more accurate they become down the line at predicting these events, whether they're anomalies, rooms for efficiency, or potential kind of flags for dangers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Amanda. And the point that you bring is very interesting because, yes, looking at the past, the more you see, the better you learn. But that's not where machine learning actually ends. And it's very evident, and it's important to look at this point given the current pandemic situation. Now, how would an AI algorithm deal with a pandemic type of a situation because it had never seen this?
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that if there is something that can actually see and learn quickly from how things are changing and so on, it is actually artificial intelligence. As an example, these days we have seen that big businesses are suffering. We have seen that many merchants are closing down. But there are many other businesses that are also proliferating. And there are certain geographies that are doing better from a pandemic perspective, and therefore the reflection is on the business as well. Now, can you use machine learning to actually identify things like decisions that governments have taken, maybe lockdowns, maybe stringent measures and so on, versus opening the schools and so on and so forth, and their impact on the number of COVID cases? Relate that with the amount of business these companies are doing, which will tell you that this particular geography, I'm taking specific examples, but it is possible for a machine learning algorithm to actually learn that in Singapore, these were the steps that were taken, which led to reduction in the number of COVID cases, which led to increase in the business. Similarly, if some other geography is taking similar decisions, then we would know that where the businesses would improve, which of the businesses will fall, which will not. And then we can actually inform our customers ahead of time that now the curve is rising, now is the time to invest, versus now these are the merchants which will perhaps go delinquent, and therefore banks would want to cover their losses in some sense and so on. So while you are right that looking at the past makes these algorithms learn even more and better, but the other thing is also that looking at new situations helps these algorithms tune very quickly to new situations, and then people can make much more informed decisions.
Perfect. Well, that's something that likely would have been nicer kind of at the beginning, but it's great to kind of have these tools developed moving forwards as well. And the kind of potential applications that, even though we didn't have these in the beginning, we can kind of model these same scenarios against data that we have from previous recessions or other black swan events. So potential applications just kind of in that kind of, I guess, disaster or recession models is quite interesting. But it's also quite interesting to see where you kind of think we are going to be going the kind of next big leaps in machine learning and artificial intelligence. What are the kind of biggest challenges and hurdles that either you with the AI Garage or that you're kind of hearing in the space as well? What are these kind of next steps?
Yeah, I think what happens is that when someone gets a position of importance, responsibility comes along with that. Now, when an AI algorithm is making decisions such as where to invest, such as looking at an X-ray image, and instead of a doctor, AI algorithm deciding what is the diagnosis and therefore what steps need to be taken to improve and so on, it becomes even more responsible position for that algorithm. And if it is responsible, it needs to be answerable. And therefore, you would have heard terms around ethics, around transparency, around fairness in AI, because the more difficult decisions you take, the more questionable you would be. We've all heard about self-driving cars. Now, when I drive a car on the road, I drive by instincts. Let us say, I hope it doesn't happen to anyone, but let us say I am on a road and there is a 7-year-old kid and a 70-year-old person. And the only choice I have is that I would be able to save only one of them. Who do I save? We don't usually sit in rooms to discuss this, but when you are actually driving, you would just do something without having to think as much and so on. Today, we have an opportunity. If I am an AI engineer making that self-driving car, I have this opportunity to decide which one should I choose. And I have that opportunity to think about it in a nice room without having to make a split-second decision. When I start thinking about it, I myself do not know the right answer. In some cultures and societies, it is said that it is better to save the 7-year-old child because that child has a lot of future and lot of scope to provide to the society. On the other hand, some other cultures say that the 70-year-old person has a lot more wisdom to offer to the society. I'm not getting into the right and wrongs of things, but these are the things that people have started to think about now they had never thought about earlier. Why? Because they have to now give an answer to an AI engineer who is now going to code that in that self-driving car. Now, what fascinates me is, of course, in some sense, the question that you asked is, in some sense, the answer is that these kind of challenges in terms of making sure that AI algorithms are fair, they are transparent, they are right. How do you decide what is right and wrong? And then be able to tell tomorrow if someone asks me, my algorithm should be able to explain to the court of the law why it did the decision that it took. Around the same lines are questions around what data am I using to come to these decisions? Am I allowed to use those data sources or not? As an example, the standard stuff that happens in e-commerce industries. I want to buy this particular product, but I show you something else also because I had seen that you had browsed other things as well. Very simple, but are you allowed to see and reflect upon what I have been browsing and so on? Those are other ethical kind of issues. So those are the things that AI is in some sense now being challenged to answer. And it's a fascinating area because now it again goes back to our own legal systems. And AI is now challenging the legal system. First, you tell me what is right, and then I'm going to put it in my algorithm. And if I ask you whether to choose a 7-year-old person or a 70-year-old person, you don't have an answer. Which is so fascinating because now human beings are actually questioning these simple things so that they can let the AI algorithms know. And therefore, it's not just a challenge for AI, which is fine, or a challenge for the technology, but also a challenge for human beings. So human beings are also evolving as the technology is evolving. And that is some sense, I feel, is the great contribution to mankind from AI.
Definitely, definitely. It's these solutions that are kind of allowing us to look at these integral questions that we have perhaps been too distracted by kind of the other elements going on to sit back and go, oh, wait, what is this kind of philosophical question here? And it's something that's being brought up currently. I know the Instagram algorithm is currently under fire for having kind of racial tendencies as well. So it's interesting to see how these will adapt overall. But really interesting that you brought up the kind of legislative perspective, because that's something that I personally, and I'm sure you might agree with me here, that's something that there's a big gap that needs to be bridged there, where governments and lawmakers and policymakers are not necessarily up to snuff or completely understanding how these works. I mean, obviously, it goes above quite a lot of our heads, the actual technologies of it. But it is an interesting question of how can we monitor and assess these and make sure that they are operating ethically when there's such a big gap there. How do you think is the kind of best way to close that gap? Is that kind of creating more task forces that have the experience like yourself to kind of advise governments and policymakers? Is this something that just kind of needs to take on a life of its own and will develop and create its own rules? It'd be really interesting to see your thoughts on this.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing it up, because I missed when you had earlier said, what are we doing here at AI Garage and Mastercard? Because we are not just building the solutions that I talked to you about. One of the mandate for AI Garage is to also educate the larger Mastercard ecosystem somehow about what this technology is to a certain extent and level, so that no matter what a person is doing at Mastercard, whether that person is a salesperson or a marketing person or an HR person or an IT person, they would know some amount of information about AI, which is required for them to actually execute this role in a new world order. And when I say a new world order, it means that it is in some sense saying that if I do not know how to use mobile phones in this current day and age, no matter what I am doing, I will be handicapped. Similarly, if I am doing, as you're saying, if I'm in the government, if I'm in legislation, and if I do not know what AI technology is, I may not actually be able to drive the right rules and ethics and policies that are required for that government or for that organization. And therefore, I don't really think that it will just evolve, as you said in the second part, and let's take it the way it will automatically, people will learn and so on. So coming back, what AI Garage is doing is that it actually conducts education sessions across different divisions of Mastercard, and it is trying to implant seeds of AI in all the divisions, which means seeds means people who are more interested from a technical front in terms of understanding AI, and they start to get much more involved. Some people would know at a superficial level, but as long as you have one or two people who know things at the depth, while they are HR people, while they are IT people, while they are sales people, slowly it will spread around and grow. And once that happens, then irrespective of what your job is, you would be able to take the right decisions with respect to AI. As an example, the HR division within Mastercard is using one of our technologies which can actually match a resume with a job description, and which is an AI algorithm, which is fine, but the HR division now is smart enough to ask us questions like, is it actually bringing in some bias in your resume selection? Because I am training on my past samples. And if the past samples say that a person for a particular job, we mostly hired from X demographics, next time when I get a person for that same demographics, the algorithm would be favoring that person. Isn't it so good that the HR team is actually aware at this level, and therefore it can ask us a question and therefore question us, are you introducing bias in your AI algorithm? So that level of education is, I think, significantly important. Some of within Mastercard, it is our team who is doing it, but externally also, I'm very happy to see that there are a large number of courses which talk about AI for business leaders and so on, without going into the math of things, but at least to see how they can affect the businesses. And those kind of things and the kind of things that I'm talking about hopefully will create an ecosystem wherein we all know enough, rather than taking it at the top of our head, enough for us to actually carry on the work that we are supposed to be delivering.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that is really important, making sure there is that kind of baseline knowledge and baseline intelligence around AI and how it works. Because on the one hand, you'll have the engineers and the modelers who are very skilled and adept at setting the parameters and getting the systems going. But it's also the people that are working in each sector that know the ins and outs of their sector. And it's really just kind of getting those to work in harmony rather than this kind of pure pattern recognition, as you said, that could lead to more kind of biases in hiring and other situations as well. So it's really nice to hear someone kind of talking about all sides of that matter.
Yeah. And the other thing is also that AI is being used to tackle significantly societally important problems. So, as an example, I don't know if you know about this, that there was a competition supported by the White House to predict the number of COVID cases given the number of COVID cases in the past and so on. And incidentally, iGarage also participated in it and finished in the top 10 and so on, but that's not more important. The important thing is that people are using AI to predict the number of COVID cases in a particular region, then predict the number of cases out of which will get hospitalized, then predict the number of cases out of that which will need an ICU, then go and figure out does that particular region has as many ICU beds or not. If not, what is the next region wherein you can go and so on. So ahead of time, if organizations in this situation of crisis can use an algorithm or a technology solution like artificial intelligence to actually handle the pandemic, I see that as a really important manifestation of technology being trying to improve the real societal needs. And there is a significantly large area around AI for social good, wherein people are trying to use AI for all kinds of possibilities with respect to trying to predict the weather conditions so that farmers can generate more crops, which is so important for societies like us or helping us in the pandemic situation that I talked about. So those things are actually even more fascinating because they are, again, as I say, I mean, I'm always fascinated by technology actually evolving human beings to the next level. One of the most important technology, and if you see human evolution as, if you measure human evolution by saying that our life expectancy is increasing, then the life expectancy in the last 2 or 3 thousand years had increased significantly using one technology more than 300-400 years back. And that technology was actually washing of hands. It's not a technology, but it actually increased the lifespan significantly because the infant mortality rate dropped significantly and therefore the lifespan increased. Now, if we are talking about AI being used for this kind of a pandemic and if it can really increase the lifespan, I would say that's a direct impact on the human evolution, which fascinates.
Definitely. It's that kind of going back to that kind of increasing efficiencies all around. The kind of biggest thing that you do get is the benefit of time, the either time to prepare, time to analyze, time to interpret, and then put systems in place rather than working from a kind of backwards and hindsight approach. It is really fascinating.
Absolutely.
So you've had an incredibly rich career so far, looking at the kind of speech operation side of things, going into the research of artificial intelligence, and now where you're at the AI Garage with Mastercard. Is there anyone in particular, perhaps a mentor or family member or anyone in your life that really kind of shaped your experience and your kind of drive and desire, and that perhaps if you didn't have them in your life or have that sort of interaction, you would be somewhere different doing something else?
You want me to name that person?
If you like.
Okay, sure. So this is slightly tangential, but not as much to artificial intelligence. But I've been involved in meditation, which is a practice to, in some sense, increase the concentration and the brain and so on and so forth. But actually what meditation does is that there are neurons in our brain, and each neuron is connected by something known as a synapse. As we grow until the age of 8 or so, our synapses keep increasing, which means our neurons keep increasing the connections and so on. And we are able to continuously increase the amount of things that we can do, learn, perceive, and so on and so forth. In machine learning, a neural network, the reason why it is called as a deep neural network is because it has too many layers of neurons. So in a computer also, the more the number of neurons and these connections increase, which becomes a deep neural network for which we need high performing GPU machines and so on, the more it becomes accurate and the more it can predict things and so on and so forth. Similarly, the human mind, the more it actually does this, I mean, I can increase the GPU power by purchasing another GPU machine and getting more cores and so on and so forth, and increasing the neural network of my machine. But the neural network is a replication of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do I increase the neural network of my brain? We don't have as much clue, at least not many people have as much clue. But when you meditate, actually it increases the number of neurons and synapses, and therefore there are lots of studies being done. The one that I'm reminded of is at University of Michigan, where there has a complete department that they have been looking at the brain scans of people who meditate and so on, and how it evolves and all that. So, but anyway, to come to your question, a long story short, I would want to actually emphasize the power of meditation, which helps increase the deep neural network of the brain. And it does many more things, but that's what is, in some sense, I would, if there is one person or so, I would want to say that that's the one that has given me significant help throughout my career and life. Yeah, just one thing is that since this area is very, I don't know if I should use the word hyped, but it is definitely very talked about everywhere, AI, machine learning, and there are a lot of things that are maybe right, that maybe not be right, and so on, but there's a significant hype. Now, what happens when things are significantly hyped is that everyone would want to talk about them. And unfortunately, at times, some people really know the stuff and some people just talk about it because it is fashion to do so. And what it leads to is that people who are wanting to get into this path would want to learn and know, and they would want to take the right career moves, they would want to do the right courses and so on. And if there are enough people who are just talking without knowing and misguiding others in some sense, not intentionally, but also it sometimes happens. Therefore, I would just say that anyone who would want to get into this area of AI and machine learning should definitely choose the right sources, because there are too many wrong sources at this point in time. Whenever something hypes up, there are usually a lot, it comes with a lot of noise as well. And therefore, it's important to filter the noise and focus on the sources that are much more relevant, that look much more genuine in some sense. Because as you said, everyone will have to, whether it is legal or anyone or whosoever, would have to know some amount of AI. And therefore, it's a requirement for everyone. And therefore, everyone should actually know where to look to, rather than just going into whatever is on your way in some sense. That I think is becoming really important.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. Well, Nitendra, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you today, hearing a bit about your experience as well as the work that you're doing with the AI Garage at Mastercard and the kind of fantastic and amazing applications in terms of efficiencies and prevention techniques, both in terms of kind of everyday business practices as well as kind of large black swan events like COVID-19. But thank you very much for your time, and as we like to say on the show, for moving the human story forward.
Wonderful. And thanks for having me, Amanda. I'm really fascinated by the vision of ideaX, and it's really wonderful to have, in some sense, thought along with you, because some of the questions that you asked were pretty thought-provoking as well. So that has definitely carried even my human story forward.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm touched. Thank you.